Hello and welcome to the latest in our webinar series on digital transformation. These projects are critical to the growth strategy of many businesses today, but they come with a high degree of risk. One of those key risks is cybersecurity, with a wave of UK and EU regulation coming into force already this year and in the very near future. Here today to talk about the impact of cybersecurity and the new regulations on your digital transformation projects, we have our experts James and Tom. Of course, if you would like to discuss any of the issues covered today or in any of our series in general, then we'd be delighted to hear from you. Do get in touch. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Tom, so what regulations are shifting the dial when it comes to cybersecurity aspects of digital transformation projects?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think in recent years, in the EU and the UK as well, there's been a real focus on uplifting levels of operational resilience sort of across the market, really. And that's translated into a number of new regulations in the space that are really likely to have a fairly big impact on digital transformation projects. One of the main ones that jumps out is DORA, which is the Digital Operational and Resilience Act. So that's an EU regulation that's specific to the financial services sector. And a lot of the requirements in that act sort of bite directly, I suppose, on financial entities themselves. But having said that, almost all organisations that provide services to financial entities are going to be impacted by that act in one way or another. That's because the act requires financial entities to take various measures in relation to ICT service providers, including things like enhanced due diligence obligations, mandatory contractual flowdowns, as well as issues that, although not mandatory to deal with in the contract, will probably, realistically speaking, need to be included in digital transformation contracts because the financial entities are just going to need assistance from their providers to comply with those obligations. Another regulation that's worth mentioning is NIS2, which you might have heard a bit about. So that's an update to the EU's existing Network and Information Systems Directive, which, again, like DORA, aims to sort of uplift levels of operational resilience. But unlike DORA, it has a broader scope, so it applies across a fairly vast array of sectors, including some new sectors compared to the NIS1 directive, so things like manufacturing, space, food, that sort of thing, but also particularly relevant to sort of digital transformation. It captures the ICT service management sector, so it will impose direct obligations on organisations operating in those sectors, including in relation to things like cybersecurity risk management, supply chain management, security incident reporting, that sort of thing. And many of those issues are likely to be relevant in the context of digital transformation contracts. So those are a couple of the regulations that we're really seeing sort of shift the dial in this space.
That's really interesting. Sounds like there's a lot going on.
For sure.
Well, thanks, Tom. James, so what has led to this increased focus on cybersecurity from regulators?
What we're seeing is just an increased focus on cybersecurity because of, first of all, the prevalence of attacks on network information systems, and I think a recognition from the market and from regulators that network and information systems are increasingly important to our everyday lives. So the disruption that can be caused by cyber incidents has really been felt by a lot of incidents over the past few years where it's not necessarily just involved personal data processing and things like that, but it's actually started to impact critical infrastructure like energy and other areas. So I think what we're seeing is just a recognition that there is a greater need for appropriate cybersecurity measures, and that the EU is seeing this as something that needs to be more prescriptive to make sure that businesses do the right thing.
Right, fantastic. Bringing it back to digital transformation projects, are these new and updated regulations likely to have an impact on contractual terms that you'd see?
Yes, a short answer is yes, they're likely to have fairly big impact. So jumping back into, I suppose, DORA specifically, that sets out a number of matters that financial entities have to, as a matter of course, deal with in their contracts with ICT providers. So that includes things like information security standards, audit rights for the financial entity, an ability for the financial entity to terminate in circumstances, those sorts of things. On top of that, DORA also includes sort of a level of enhanced obligations where the relevant ICT service provider is supporting a critical or important function of the financial entity. And I think that's probably going to be fairly likely where you're talking about a large-scale digital transformation project. It's also worth mentioning that there's a number of regulatory technical standards to DORA, and those go into greater detail and sort of expand on a number of the requirements in the text of DORA itself. And although sort of the flow downs of things from those regulatory technical standards aren't mandatory per se, realistically speaking, elements of those will need to be flowed down in digital transformation contracts to, again, enable the financial entity to comply with its obligations. Turning then to NIS 2, it doesn't contain what I would sort of call mandatory flow downs per se, like DORA. Having said that, the annex to the Commission implementing Regulation 2, NIS 2, does actually require all in-scope entities in that broad range of sectors that we talked about to ensure their supply chain contracts deal with certain matters where it's appropriate to do so. That includes things like cybersecurity requirements, training for employees of the provider, security incident management, audit rights, that sort of thing. So some areas of overlap with the DORA requirements, but also some unique areas as well. And then as with DORA, there's other obligations under NIS 2 which aren't called out directly as having to be included in the contracts, but realistically speaking will need to be dealt with in those contracts.
So James, outside of contractual terms, is there anything else that organisations going through a digital transformation project will need to do to comply with these new regulations?
Absolutely. I think one of the fundamental aspects of these new regulations is that they require a lot more policies and procedures and governance controls to be in place to protect against cybersecurity risks and the like. So actually, a lot of the prescriptive requirements will mean that clients will need to follow their policies on change management in particular. There's a lot of change in a digital transformation project when you might be moving something from on-premises to the cloud or bringing on a range of different service providers to integrate services together and deliver a result. That also increases the attack surface, so that needs to be recognised, and you have to have appropriate documentation and practical controls in place to make sure that you're managing all of the complex issues that can come up, like data transfers and things like that. And of course, all of this should be documented properly. So one of the principles of these regulations is that you need to be accountable for what you're doing. So it's not just a matter of putting some contract terms in place, actually having the right policies and procedures, following them and being able to demonstrate that you've complied with them is really important.
So it sounds like organisations can be impacted sometimes directly or sometimes via their customers through flow downs. If that is the case, what should they be doing to ensure that they're ready to comply?
Well, the first thing is that they need to understand how they fit into these new regulations, or if they fit into them. So the classification of what they're doing and who their customers are and what sort of regulations apply is critical. We're helping a lot of clients do that at the moment just to figure out what their obligations are. Once organisations have determined that they are in scope, there's a range of things that need to happen. Clearly, if you're an ICT service provider to a financial entity, a lot of those requirements will be contractual, although there are certain categories of entities who will be directly regulated under DORA, even if they're on the service provider side. In terms of NIS 2, there are registration requirements if you're in scope, and that is quite a complex question because NIS 2 is a directive, and so there are different local law implementations around Europe, and you might actually have to navigate some quite complex issues to figure out where you're going to be regulated and where you need to register as a starting point when those local laws come into force. On top of that, I think the main thing is to do gap assessments against the new standards. Actually, a lot of the principles of these new regulations already exist in the form of international information security standards like ISO 27001 and ISO 27002 or SOC 2 are similar standards that are out there. So actually a lot of organisations will already have some of those policies and procedures and governance measures and security measures in place. But the key thing is to identify the gaps. You need to map the procedures and the policy documents, etc., to figure out what you need to improve in order to comply. So that's quite critical. And I think the next thing is to make sure that you're covering the correct scope of what's being regulated. So at the moment, I think some people might focus on cybersecurity in their delivery centres or business service areas. but actually that might not align with the network and information systems or ICT services that are actually going to be regulated by these regulations. So there is often an increase in scope, and you need to pass through your policies and procedures on a DORA basis through the business. Then there's all of the questions around supply chain, I think, and the practical steps that you need to take in order to comply. So this includes everything from potentially on the financial entity side doing threat-led penetration testing, if they're designated by regulators in the future to do that. It's getting ready for that. That's really important. ICT third-party service providers will need to prepare for those things as well as audit arrangements to ensure that they're able to comply. And I think probably the more challenging thing is how you deal with this in what is inherently a complex supply chain these days. So there are a lot of flow down requirements, both in terms of contractual terms, but also in terms of the diligence that you need to undertake in your supply chain around your network and information systems and things like that, and figuring out how secure your supply chain actually is. And so whilst you might be able to assess, your own offices or your own systems that you're in control of, actually, often it's a more difficult process to look at that down your supply chain when you've essentially got a range of new and more onerous requirements that you need to put in place. So that's just sort of to highlight some of the things you need to do. I think probably what's concerning many clients the most is around some of the responsibilities for management bodies as well. I think that's worth just highlighting for a second. Under NIS 2, management bodies do have responsibilities. They need to have supervision and sign off of the information security policies and procedures that need to be in place. They have to undertake mandatory training. And of course, in some jurisdictions, what we're seeing under local law is that the duties under the NIS 2 directive will essentially become akin to directors' duties. So there will be consequences for those management bodies if they don't get it right.
So, we've heard a lot today about the new regulations and what they mean for digital transformation projects. If you have any questions or you're concerned about how this will impact on your projects at the moment, do please get in touch, whether that's to do with supply chain due diligence, contract terms, management liability or other bits and pieces besides. We're here to help, and we've been working with lots of clients on these very issues along the way. Thank you very much.